Is that fine for everybody? Well, I don't know about you, but I've been really looking forward to this.
I suppose I could say I have too.
This is a rare opportunity, isn't it, to sit in such close proximity both to the artist and to the works. And what we're going to hear tonight, I hope, is Robert expounding on, some of the ideas that lay behind these works, some of the motivations for them, some of the inspirations for them. And I mean, there's not much point in introducing Robert Juniper to you formally. I'm sure you all know who he is, but I'll do that a little bit later anyway, in spite of that. Before we do, I just want to start by telling you a story which I think is appropriate. You won't hear much from me tonight, by the way, you'll be pleased to know. It'll be Robert talking mostly, but I just want to say something about Aboriginality in this country and what a great country we have. And I know that Robert's bound up with the Aboriginal cause as well. There's a wonderful man that comes from the Kimberley area, Jimmy Pike, whom you'd know about. Great designer. In fact, he designed my tie, yes. I especially wore this tie tonight. But Jimmy Pike and his wife Pat have recently produced a book. Did any of you read it? A little book called Jimmy and Pat Meet the Queen? No? Oh, good. Yeah? Sorry? Yes. Well, in this book, Jimmy and Pat Meet the Queen, it's an imaginary story, of course, and the Queen arrives in Australia and Jimmy and Pat meet her at Broome Airport. The Royal Jet lands and they're there to meet her in the four-wheel drive with the dog in the back, the brown cross kelpie in the back covered in dust. And Jimmy and Pat, in this book, decide that they're going to take the Queen out into the bush for a while. And she comes down the steps of the Royal Plane and she's introduced to Jimmy and Pat as the Queen of Australia. And of course they shake hands and everything, and then they've got the Thomas Cook clothing and everything for her to change into, and she changes and they're into the four-wheel drive and away into the bush. And Jimmy Pike apparently was very intrigued by this idea that she was the Queen of Australia, and he decided that he might just test this out a little bit. So they're driving along through the bush in the Kimberley area, and he says to her, "Do you think we should camp over there?" And she says, "Oh, that looks like a nice place. Yes, we'll camp over there." And he says, No, we can't camp there." And so they go on further, and he says, "Do you think we should camp over there?" "No, we won't camp over there." And then getting towards nightfall, Jimmy decides, well, this is the place we should camp because there's a water hole here and there'll be food and there'll be water. And the Queen says, "Well, I would have never known that there was a water hole here. How do you know that?" So he explained that he'd known it. It was his country, his territory. He knew it intimately, and he knew where all the water holes were. And that night with Pat, before he went to bed, he said to her, "How can this bugger be Queen of Australia? She doesn't even know where the water holes are." So Australia is a vast place, and it's a place which means different things to different people. What it means to Jimmy Pike and what it means to you and what it means to Robert are probably a range of different things. So I would like now just to like you to meet Robert Juniper, whose works are surrounding us. These works do come largely from Arnhem Land and from the Kimberley area.
Broome and
Broome.
the Kimberleys.
The Kimberley and Broome. So it's quite marvellous to see this, because there are certain colours and certain evocations of that district that come out quite clearly in the paintings themselves. I think that, however, these are your personal responses to the areas. Is that fair to say?
And the initial personal responses to I know Broome very well because I've been going up there on and off for the last 30 years. And my wife works up there full time as a psychologist for the community, and I go up as often as I can. And I had two big dogs, and it was a bit hard to find a doggy sitter for them. But now they've got a big hearth rug in the sky, I can be a bit more sort of free. So I go up to Broome quite often, and I've got a nice studio there in our house, and I just love the ambience of the place, and I work flexi time up there. Say if the tide is at 5 o'clock in the morning, I can go fishing and then come back and work, and then the tide is 50 minutes later next day. So it progresses until it's sort of in the middle of the day, and that's when I work all the time in the studio. And then when it's in the evening, I go fishing again. So that's the way I work up there. Apropos of your story about Jimmy and Pat, I see them quite often in the local supermarket up there, and we stop and have a chat. But because of the book, some bright spark sent a copy to Buck House, and they were invited to go and have afternoon tea with the Queen and Prince Philip. And I don't know what the Queen thought of the rather bad language in the book, but there's a glossary in the back. Or she actually says in one instance when Jimmy Pike shows her a waterhole, she said, "Well, I'll be buggered," she said. and at the back there's a glossary of terms, some of which are Aboriginal, and the F word comes up spelled F-U-G-G-I-N, and Pat, who wrote the glossary, said a term to lend emphasis to a statement. Anyway, that's beside the point.
Yeah.
So, and just recently I had this request from my family or members of my family in Darwin to go up there and have a sort of a family get-together, and that's the Litchfield family, who came here. It's on my mother's side of our family tree. Litchfield came to this country in 1835, and he was a tinsmith from Derby, and he ended up being the chief constable of Port Macquarie in New South Wales. And his descendants, are you interested in this?
Yes.
Yeah. Right, okay. So his descendants, including my grandfather, got involved in the mining industry as engineers and indeed prospectors. So that gave me my sort of interest in going over the old ground where they came from Tingha, New South Wales to Western Australia, and they both perished in the course of the work. My grandfather George Litchfield died in a bushfire when a tree fell on him, and my great uncle Albert, he was 21. His tent caught fire, and he went in to rescue his belongings and perished in that. And anyway, that's a brief history of the Litchfield family. And I went to Darwin. While we were there, we decided to go to Arnhem Land. I'd never been there, and never been to Darwin. But went to Owen Pelly, where I could indulge myself in looking at landscape and fishing for barramundi, which was the fishing for barramundi was very successful, and I'm working on the landscapes. And so some of these images, quite a few of them, are actually from Kakadu, Arnhem Land, and the traveller's palm there is on Melville Island, where the Tiwi people live and work. They make these marvellous poles. You're probably familiar with them from the art gallery. And they were sitting around in this lovely sort of camp with blunt axes and chopping at these poles to make burial poles to put around the recently deceased. And they're beautiful works of art, but I was astonished that they just leave them to the elements, and they go back to natural, all the paintbrushes off. So I put a little reminder of that in there.
So do you consider that, well, obviously it's a sculptural form, but
Yeah,
it's
sure,
something that's
surely is.
very engaging, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's when you can't see it, Robert's referring to the Tiwi burial pole and this painting on this wall. You might want to look at it later.
You've probably got a very good collection of them in the National Gallery here. We certainly do in Western Australia.
There's a very fine collection of it in the Art Gallery in New South Wales. They're called Pukamani poles, and they do mark the grave of recently deceased. I just say that while we're chatting, by the way, we welcome questions from anybody, and I know that some of you have got some questions because you've already asked me about. There's a question right there now.
To
The National Gallery of Painting.
how do I get?
How do we get to see them? Are they involved or?
What? No, the Tiwi poles. No, they're on display as a big sort of like almost like a forest that's been sort of metamorphosed.
Well, considering that we've started on this this Aboriginal theme, it might be nice to follow that along a bit. I read something that you repeatedly said at one time, and that is that basically I would prefer to live in a cave, or at least in a confined, enfolding, harbouring, stone dwelling. Do you remember saying that, and what did you mean by that?
Well, I'm a bit of a troglodyte, that's what that means. But my house in Darlington, as a concession to that, I built a little sort of low ceiling place that I can sort of get into and retire and watch TV or listen to music. And well, I have a bit of one always has conflict with one's close person, my wife in this case, who loves the open air and the garden. So I'm a sort of a cave dweller, and she likes the open air. So we managed to get along with it.
You've also used the word atavistic or atavism from time to time, a word which refers to what has previously happened in the landscape. Is that something that you follow now?
Well, it's not that. It's the sort of pleasurable feeling of being rather scared or alarmed about the environment that you're in, which is, and when I use that expression, it was like a desert, which a lot of people call it hostile, but I think it's totally benign. It's the way you treat it that hurts if you get it wrong. And so there is this sort of feeling that when you're out in the bush, you might sort of get the car bogged or something like that, and you've only got a certain amount of beer or water supply or something like that. And so that's what I meant by that atavistic sort of the sort of thrill or the adrenaline rush of being slightly sort of on the edge of disaster.
But one of your concerns in your art also is the idea of the landscape having been occupied before at some time.
Yeah, well, that's the sort of thing that I rather like doing. I suppose one could use the metaphor of a blank canvas being like a desert, and what I do with it is put some colour on it, and then sometimes I work horizontally, quite in the initial stages of the painting. So I might even put an arbitrary sort of wash of colour and let it happen, rather like what happens in the desert. If you look at it from the air, there's this wonderful sort of patterns that you really couldn't invent, because you'd have to sort of you'd have to be more skillful than I am to invent it. So you let the washes of colour do what they want, and then they make demands about you about what you're going to put in it, and the desert itself, where I go, the old gold mining towns, which have totally disappeared, except for the detritus that the miners have left behind, sort of little bits of broken crockery and maybe a concrete foundation for a house, which are little formal things in this sort of rather arbitrary desert wash that I put there. So hence, there's a very good example of it there on that wall with the on the main wall here. Yeah. See, I imagine a lot of people looking at that would think it was an abstract painting. Well, it's an abstraction, of course, but to me it's quite representational of what I see. Like striated rocks and the remains of a wall that has been graffitied or something like that, and then the little bits of coloured markers that sort of like Persian miniature, I suppose, only on a large scale. So, and that's the way I sort of build these paintings on.
The signs coming to you.
Signs that it's the nearest thing we have to in this country, I suppose, as a past civilization. I'm talking about white people now, because we hadn't been here that long, only a couple of hundred years. And of course the other thing, which I am intrigued with, is the marvelous sort of art that our black brethren have done and left behind up there, which is mind-boggling, in its antiquity and its sophistication. It's only just been recently. I may be sort of flying off at tangents here, but it's only in recent times that we've been beginning to take notice of Aboriginal art, and it really is very, very sophisticated,
Yeah.
and very ancient too.
Well, it's been polished up for a long time, hasn't it? About 40,000 years. Talking about that painting particularly, and that idea in general, are those images seen necessarily from the air, or are they something that
Some of them are. I juxtapose aerial views with close-up thing, and that's where the abstraction of it comes in.
But you do like flying, as I understand.
I do, yeah. And you might have heard of my friend Richard Waldendorp, who's a very, very fine photographer, Dutchman. But never mind.
Good man.
When he's behind a camera, he's the poet. So I tell him that too. So we have very good rapport, and we've often shared the cost of a light aircraft and flown, over the country, up around Queensland, Cape York, and he's brought out several books of aerial landscapes, and they are just like man-made abstractions on the thing.
Is that an inspirational thing for you to do?
It is very much, and I've often borrowed his images and worked on them. I've on occasions been with him in the aircraft. He's looking out one side and I'm looking out the other side. We've both got our Asahi Pentax. Mine become snapshots, and his are works of art.
How do you think somebody like Rover Thomas approaches that same problem?
I don't know. It's uncanny how the Aborigines, and Rover in particular, makes these sort of aerial things, and they don't. I suppose they're closer to nature than we are. Let's face it. I mean, we've lost that closeness, but so they can actually make a map by sort of representing a water hole here and a track there, which become those wonderful circles, and then a line here. So Rover, of course, simplifies it down to what we'd call minimal art.
Yes. Do you have a judgment on Rover? I mean, do you have an estimation of his importance?
No, I don't, and I think it's almost impossible to judge an epoch of art from a standpoint within that epoch. So I don't like making comments about my peers' work, because I might have it totally wrong, and vice versa, especially with critics.
So do you embrace people like Quentin McKenzie and Jack Britton and Rover as peers?
Of course.
Regardless of anything else.
Sure.
Well, you're all aware, of course, of Rover and the fact that he died earlier this year, I think in April, and he was a great Western Australian living in Turkey Creek, or Warman community, and that particular community has been instrumental in producing a marvellous style of art, which is not so far removed from your own, really, is it? That idea of the aerial view of the landscape and
it's not, but
minutated single landscape.
Well, all it comes down to is organising shapes and objects on a two-dimensional surface. But to my limited knowledge of what the Aborigine is about is that it's you can read it like a map and explain it. I was telling somebody earlier on about there's an Aboriginal. He's part Aboriginal, part Chinese in Broome. Where you get this mixture of races, and he makes these wonderful little woolen and twig mandala things.
This is Roy Wiggins.
Roy Wiggins,
Yeah.
yeah. And I went with Mary Maha to his house one day, and she had a tape recorder and she wanted to record the songs, and he had about 10 or 12 of these, all different, but beautiful coloured wools and strings, and he read them like a musical score. He said, you know, this one is where my great uncle was paddling his mangrove raft across from One Arm Point to the islands, and it capsized, and he was menaced by a crocodile, and he's reading it like from these strings. I don't know how much bull dust was attached to it, but it sounded, you know. But anyway, he told the story and did this 10 times with different stories, and then he put it down on the table, and he gets his 2 sticks, and he goes, "No, how does this go?" And he goes, click, 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 and guy, and as it goes on. And he's reading it like a musical score, and he did that 10 times, and Mary, of course, recorded them. So
there's something that's quite important in that, and that is that Aboriginal people don't have any literary tradition, and the way that they pass on their information is through the visual arts. And that is something that stands outside the Western tradition of art, I think, in that significance that it has. You can't go and open up the Encyclopedia of Aboriginality and find out where you came from, but you can if you listen to your elders, hear what they sing and what they chant and what they do and the way that they make art. Well, we'll finish with that. Tell us about fishing. A quarter of this exhibition is about fish.
Yeah.
Why should that be?
Well, this is a very small percentage of fish, you know, because, well, I'm passionate about fishing, and I'm not a game fisherman, because I don't hold with the idea of tormenting a beautiful creature and then throwing it back into the water.
I only kiss and catch fisherman?
No, I'm not. Only if it's something that I can't eat or give away to somebody else. But no, I'm not. I'm quite against game fishing. You know, the people go out and catch a sailfish or a marlin just for the sake of having it leaping all over the water for some sort of masher satisfaction. No, I catch fish to eat, and that's. But I'm sort of passionate about it. And,
you told me earlier that you could go fishing every day of the week if you had the opportunity. Is it really?
Well, when I'm in Broome, I do.
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
What is it? But there must be something. I mean, there must be some fishermen in the audience as well.
Well, it's a pastime where you can contemplate things, you know, and
very slow, isn't it?
Well, maybe for you.
It is for me always.
No, there's always some excitement on the Broome Jetty where some tourist or other has brought tackle that's far too light, and they catch this fish a metre long, and they had no way of bringing it up on the jetty, and I've got all the equipment to do that because I've got a sliding gaff. And they say, "Oh, thanks, mister," you know. So, yeah. So that's what I do.
You're involved. I mean, with those beautiful drawings of the crabs and lots of fish. Do you find that the lines of sea creatures are appealing?
Yeah.
And the colours?
Yeah.
Is it something to do also with where the earth meets the sea?
Well, it certainly is, and this is the point about this painting here. When I was in Broome last year, we had I think about 17 inches of rain in about 6 hours or something like that. It was some enormous downpour, and the colour of the earth is that ferric oxide, that red, and I went down to Cable Beach. Actually, this is not Cable Beach. This is further up the coast. It's Price's Point. But I like the shape of the rocks, so I took a little bit of artistic license with that. But where this great flood of fresh water mixed with the ferric oxide of the land went out into this beautiful turquoise ocean, it looked like a great sort of a river of blood, and that's what I did. And for a bit of further interest, I put the black man and the white man casting for baitfish. I've learned how to do that too, which is a skill that an Aboriginal showed me. Which is
and baitfish, obviously, is the
throwing the net, so that it goes in a perfect circle and drops down.
That'd be a handy skill for a fisherman to have.
Yeah.
Bait's the essential thing.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Now, if we can switch away from fishing, I'd like to ask you about this idea of discussing art. I've talked to a lot of artists over a long period of time, and many of them are not prepared to put into words ideas about their paintings. And you have said in the past, my imagery is often allegorical about my personal experience, and I don't explain it in words. I leave it for others to interpret. Does that
Can I
seem
go
fair
home
to
now?
you all? Yes, you can go now. Thank you.
No, come on.
Does that seem fair to you all, though, that
yeah.
Robert puts a painting up on the wall and is not prepared to talk to you about it? Yes? Yeah? Why should that be?
Well, I don't think so. Right, you painter.
Exactly.
Yeah, that is true, and like a lot of artists, most artists, I think, I don't like talking about my own work because, but I don't mind explaining how I arrived at the imagery to anybody, and indeed telling the technique that I use to do that, because a lot of the people I talk to are artists and most not artists, students, and like most students, they're terrified by a blank canvas, which I am too, you know, and don't know how to, and are terrified by the box of paints. You know, it's you've got this pristine canvas and a box of paints, and you say, well, you know, I'm going to stuff it up, and you know, that sort of thing. So I don't mind sharing techniques, and if you can do it better than I can, well, that's your good luck. And people say, aren't you afraid of giving your secrets away? And I said, there's no secrets. I can teach any normal, intelligent person how to paint within about 35 minutes. But what you do with that technique is your concern, you know. And it's very simple, you know.
Is there a question then?
Do you, when you are confronted by a blank canvas, do you already have in your mind a prepared composition, or do you?
When I walk up to it, I do, yeah.
So you spend quite a bit of time.
Yeah, but quite often you start off with an initial idea, and as I said, I paint horizontally and then let the accidental sort of things take place. And I thought, oh, I couldn't thought of that. So then the painting takes over, and you start to. There's a dialogue with the paint, you know. So, okay, I need a bit of blue over here. The painting says this to me, and I need a bit of red to, and I need a repetition of that blue somewhere else, and maybe a contrasted colour. It's rather like a musical composition in a way. If you struck a chord on a piano, you would then say, okay, well, that sounds all right, and then it has to. We use the same sort of terminology as musicians. You know, you use harmony, contrast, colour, rhythm, yeah, repetition, that sort of thing. Yeah. So as I've wandered off the subject a bit, but anyway.
You do quite a preparation.
Yeah, and I had, like these Kakadu and Arnhem Land ones, I looked at, you know, the photographs that I'd taken, which were sort of an aide-memoire, and then I sort of, see, I've been sort of painting deserts for years, like, you know, variations on that sort of thing, so I'm got into the water, which is a challenge and a different discipline, you know, and it might work and it might not, you know.
Do you remember the realistic sketching as a starting point?
Yeah.
And apart from that?
Yeah, sure.
So when you go out on these long trips, you lose a lot of sketching?
No, very, very little, because I've generally got my family with me, or, you know, and it's a bit of an imposition to say, oh, hang on for half an hour in the heat and the mosquitoes and flies and things like that. No, I'd really like to work in the privacy of my studio, I mean, if you saw me in my studio, you'd think, you know, it's like watching grass grow. You know, sort of. I'm standing there, and my dog even gets upset. She thinks I've gone into some catatonic state. You know, so I'm standing there, and the dog comes up and whimpers.
Sorry, I'm just signalling to Nadine. It's got nothing to do with what you're saying.
Oh, no.
I think we at the back they might just need to hear a little bit.
Oh, can you hear me at the back? Oh, good.
Yeah,
Good.
okay.
Turn up a little bit more.
Yep, I think so. I am a feeler, not a thinker.
Yeah, well, I'm not an intellectual, you see, and whereas a lot of painters are. And like my friend John Olsen, who some of you, most of you might know, he's an intellectual. I'm not, and I can't. Apropos of your question earlier on, do you know what you're going to do when you start out doing it? Well, sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. So this is where the feeling bit comes in, and the composition is making its demands. But I haven't got the sort of psyche to visualize the whole thing in my mind and know exactly where I'm going to put every piece of paint. That's why I stand in this sort of semi-catatonic trance, and my dog gets upset when he thinks I've died on my feet.
Oh, Lloyd Rees used to say that he always started his paintings outdoors, but when he took them into the studio, the painting itself took over.
Yeah.
That is, that
That's
certain
quite so.
curved lines or
Yeah.
certain elements of the
Yeah,
painting
sure.
would be more important than others, and they would dominate. They would end up...
Yeah.
And after all, as he also said, what we end up with is the work of art. We don't have a faithful reproduction of that aspect of the landscape or something like that. We have something that we admire as a work of art. One of Lloyd Rees' winning painting, I think 1950 in the Wynne Prize, which you've won 2 times. Lloyd won in 1950 with a painting of a block of houses, a block of terrace houses along a point in Sydney Harbour, and he put one more house in than there was actually there. And people criticised him later, and they said, "You've made a mistake, you put 6 houses in." And he said, "I needed that for the composition.
Yeah, that's right.
I needed that for the balance of the picture."
Yeah. Well, there's a similar sort of anecdote with Corot, the French impressionist, and he romantic, and he was painting a little one of his misty scenes by the Seine or where it was, and a lady came and said, "Where's that tree there?" And he said, "It's behind me."
Is that artistic license?
Yeah, that sure is.
Is that what we call it?
Yeah.
Mystery and surprise are elements in paintings that you admire?
Yeah. I don't know how quite to define that, but when in my own sort of work, I like the element of the accidental thing, which I've discussed before, and tilting a canvas to make it sort of do its right thing, like that painting, which I had to put the paint on and tip it down so it actually was copying or reproducing what was actually happening in nature. It was flowing down, and with that accidental thing, if I tried to paint that, eternally, I couldn't possibly do it. I wouldn't want to do it for a start.
The Surrealists used to say that paintings should not be explained in words, because when you explain away the mystery, you've cleared away a lot of the value of that painting.
Yeah, well, you can't really explain why you put this colour against that. It's a personal thing as far as I'm concerned, and if you like it, you like it, and if you don't, you don't. But it's a personal thing, and I'm just pleased. Might I say that I'm very flattered that all you people have turned up to listen to what I have to say, because I'm not a very loquacious person. I certainly wasn't going to give you a lecture. But,
Well, we're doing okay so far, aren't we? Is everybody enjoying this? I think we're going along quite well. The picture is poetry?
Yeah, well, that sounds a bit sort of fancy, doesn't it? But
I always get attacked when I talk to students about this. I say, this is a poetic work, and it's succeeded on a poetic level. Do you have an opinion about that?
No, it's somebody else. As a matter of fact, I don't like very much poetry, and I like a lot of it, but modern poetry leaves me cold. We won't go into that.
And several others who are nodding in the audience as well.
And a great deal of modern music. I pay the composers and the writers the courtesy of either reading or listening to it, but it's not the sort of thing I'd want to go out and buy the record or the book. Anyway, that's a personal criticism, but I may be wrong, but a lot of it just leaves me cold. But no, that's a label that was lumbered on me by somebody else. So,
Poetic.
yeah, that's not.
Does anybody here have an opinion about that? I mean, are Robert's paintings, do they contain elements of poetry? Or? Yes? Okay, well, we'll leave that. There's another agreement down there, yes. Okay. Let's talk briefly about art prizes. Robert Hughes, the art critic, has said that art prizes are the most ridiculous thing that could possibly be imagined. How can you judge that one painting's better than another?
Exactly.
And who's your judge?
Exactly.
Do you have an opinion on art prizes? You've won a few.
Yeah, but Rose Skinner, who was my agent in Perth, she wouldn't let me submit anything for the Wynne Prize, and oh, thank you very much. And she had a stroke and was in hospital and was no longer in control of my work, so I sent a painting over of the Wynne Prize. It was 6 feet square and it was too big to go into an aeroplane, so they strapped it onto a horse float of all things and sent it out, and it won the prize. The reason I sent it over was to expose my work to a wider audience like New South Wales, because people like John Olsen and Charlie Blackman and such said, we don't see any of your work over here. Only very, very small things. So anyway, that gave me a great deal of encouragement, because it was rather a prestigious sort of prize, and I was the first West Australian ever to win that. And
you won the Wynne Prize twice.
Yeah, that was several years later.
76 and 1980. Yeah. And you've also won the Helena Rubinstein Art Scholarship twice, and a range of other prizes as well.
But to get back to your question, I don't go in for prizes in my own state, because not for any reason, but we have a rather savage art critic there, and he certainly doesn't like me very much. And he's an Englishman. He comes from Bradford, and he likes to shoot down the established painters, and rather savagely too, I must admit. And we have a standing joke now in Western Australia that if he gives somebody a nice review, we say, oh, "Poor boy," You've joined the club.
My role in life is as an art historian, and consequently, I'm always looking back that way instead of looking ahead. Now, when I do look back, I find always through the history of art that critics have not had the language to deal with advances in art, with changes. No. They didn't know how to deal with Impressionism. They didn't know how to deal with abstraction. What is your general view of critics and their work?
Well, it gets back to what I said earlier on, that I think it's impossible to judge art from a standpoint within that epoch. It takes about 50 years. I mean, you take somebody like Van Gogh, for instance. He couldn't sell a painting in his lifetime, and now people pay umpteen $1 million for. But that's a different thing altogether too. That's it's like stamp collecting. That if you've got that little piece of paper that's so rare, somebody's going to pay you $1 million for it, and so there's a lot of that comes into art sales and Christie's and people like that.
Do you feel gratified though that you haven't been like Van Gogh? I mean, in your own lifetime, you've been extremely successful.
Yeah, but I might be
in
like
what
somebody
you do.
else who comes a gutser, before I die.
No, it's clear that Robert's career has been extremely successful, and we should be calling him Dr. Robert, by the way, because he's an honorary PhD from the University of Western Australia.
And it probably hasn't seeped through to this neck of the woods because it's not terribly important, but last year they gave me a slab of gold with 6 little diamonds in it in the shape of the Southern Cross, and turned me into a state's treasure, living treasure. I thought I'd just have to say that.
Well, I'd like to now just bring you to something else, and you touched on this briefly before, and that is the idea of being a Western Australian and trying to establish yourself in the eastern states. It's happened to a few people. You're certainly not the first. Kate O'Connor, one of your illustrious counterparts from Western Australia, Guy Gray Smith. But Kate particularly went through this problem, and she said that she had 3 strikes against her. She was a woman, that she lived a lot of her life in France, and that thirdly, she came from Western Australia. So how on earth was she going to make it in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane? Have you felt that distancing and a sort of an urge to secede from the country?
Well, John Olsen said to me the first time I came to Sydney, he said, "Welcome to Australia." And he said, I said, "Thanks, John." So yeah, there was a strong secession movement in Western Australia, and by the way, we could afford it. You know, we keep you people in the rest of the country well and truly buoyant with our enormous royalties from iron and gold and stuff. You know. Anyway, they said the Kalgoorlie gold paid for the Sydney Harbour Bridge for a start. Yeah. No, Kate O'Connor, she was a darling, and I met her, you know, and she was a very grumpy lady, and she'd put in 2 very beautiful paintings in the Perth Prize for Contemporary Art, and 2 of her Parisian beautiful still lifes. I don't know whether you're all acquainted with Kate O'Connor's work. She was a contemporary and a friend of people like Bonnard and Vuillard and people like that, and probably Mary Cassatt, you know, talking about being a woman. There's a couple of very fine French, famous French women painters of that particular era. But she was very grumpy because I'd rather cheekily put in a little painting like that, and it won the prize. And she said, "Well, you're very lucky." And I said, "Well, I realise that." She wrote me a letter and said, "I challenge you," and challenge was written about that big, underlined, to paint a portrait in the grand manner, you know. And I didn't take her up on that, but anyway. But we became friends after that, and I remember once. Frank Hodgkinson was having an exhibition, and it was being opened by Professor Alan Edwards, who was the professor of English at UWA, with a slight Yorkshire accent, which was very, very attractive. But he used to love to hear himself speak, and he had this sheet of notes, and he's waffling on about modern art and things in general, and because I was taller than most people, I was standing at the back, and all the people were facing that way, listening to the professor, you know, listening to his own voice. And Kate O'Connor came tottering down the stairs, and she was an absolute picture. She looked like one of her paintings. It looked like something out of the turn of the century sort of French Impressionist thing. She had a lovely dove grey scarves and hats, and her makeup looked as though it had been thrown on from about 3 feet away without the aid of a mirror. You know, there was a lipstick up there one side, and she must have been painting just before she came, because she had a daub of ultramarine blue paint on her earlobe. And she came tottering down, and she was looking at all these Frank Hodgkinson pictures like that. She went, "Ruh." She got up to me and she said, "Professor's still talking," she said, "Dear," she had that gravelly voice like a lady who's drunk too much sherry, you know, sort of, and she said, "Oh dear Robert, what a diatribe. I do hope he's saying something sensible." And all these backs of heads suddenly turned into faces, you know. And the professor didn't drop a syllable. He just carried on talking. That was one of my last memories of Kate.
Kate O'Connor's father was C.Y. O'Connor, the engineer, and as a very young person, maybe 6 or 7 or 8, you were out in that part of the country working along that, or not working, but with your parents on the pipeline.
Do you all know about the Kalgoorlie, Mundaring to Kalgoorlie pipeline? They had the gold fields there, which are all short of water because it's semi-desert. And my grandmother told me that water was 6pence a pint in those days, around about the turn of the century, which was a lot of money. And she said it was cheaper, for some extraordinary reason, to bath us kids in soda water or soft drink than buy water, because that came in by bulk sort of things. Anyway, it's one of those things. Anyway, C.Y. O'Connor, a brilliant engineer who designed and built Fremantle Harbour, had this idea of supplying or damming the Helena River, which is where I live and where I go marron fishing, and pumping the water with a series of 8 pumping stations, 750 miles to Kalgoorlie to supply Kalgoorlie and all the places in between with water, and which was a brilliant idea. And but he was criticised because John Forrest, the then governor, or the premier, he spent the entire, or what the equivalent to the entire state budget, for the year to build this. It was all done with manpower. There wasn't machinery. And they decided to take their families along with them. And myself and my sister and brothers were at that stage preschool, and we went along too. And it was one of the most marvellous sort of things that ever happened to us. It was like a continual adventure, sort of finding insects and flowers and things. And I still draw on that as memories for
Well, I thought that we should bring that out because Robert from 5, 6, 7, 8 was out there in the bush, in the desert there virtually. Now I'd like to turn back, if we can, more technical matters and consider drawing, something in which you excel, and yet you seem to be a bit reluctant about this idea of drawing. I've heard that, heard it said and heard you probably say that you would like to cultivate a sort of awkwardness in your drawing.
Yeah.
Why would that be?
Well, because I think it was only a couple of weeks ago, Giles Aughty, who writes in the Australian Review, they said he found my drawing, the particular drawing that I had submitted for an exhibition, facile, and so I've been lumbered with this. I can draw. Yeah, sure. And
that's a problem.
And so to tame this sort of, I sometimes draw with my left hand, and even on occasions with my eyes shut, just to see what happens. So I've been called facile, and our local art critic must have read Giles Aughty because he said the same thing about some drawings I had in. He said that my drawing was facile, and it looked as though I'd comfortably gone through the motions, without any sort of problem. And I wrote, and also he said he compared my work to somebody else's, which was dreadful, which I thought was dreadful. Here's me saying I don't comment about my peers, and he said Juniper's complacency, which I said I had to accept. I wrote him a little private letter, not angry. I wrote him a little private letter and said I might have to accept the observation of facility. But I say I find complacency, that's smug and self-satisfied, characteristics that I find repugnant in anybody, and particularly when it's applied to me. So I said, instead of challenging you to a duel, which I'd probably lose anyway, I said, I invite you up to my studio to have a few drinks and just see how I work. I haven't heard from him yet.
A nice solution.
Yeah.
Artists through the 20th century seem to have been concerned about drawing. Pierre Bonnard said, I would like to start over again and to draw like a child.
Yeah.
Was that?
Yeah. Well, Picasso said something similar. He said when he was 14 he could draw like Raphael, and it's taken him a lifetime to learn how to draw like a child. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yes. Well, Picasso saw the works of Juniper and said, that's what I've been trying to do all my life.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Picasso had a great collection of primitive art, and when I say primitive art, it's very sophisticated art as far as I'm concerned. But what we call primitive art, like the African art and the islands, the Pacific Islands art, and that.
I don't know about you, but I think you might want to agree that Robert's drawing is very elegant and very polished. I wouldn't call it facile, but it's a delight to see. So drawing is akin to graffiti, which is something else which is close to your heart, I think.
It's not close to my heart. I've made, my wife tells me that I make social comments all the time. I don't think I do, as a matter of fact, but there's one painting that is now in my brother's collection, or well, actually it's on extended loan, which will be going into my retrospective, which is about this time next year. I was just intrigued with that the vandalism that goes on. You know, these gold mining towns, which became defunct when the reefs cut out, they don't stay around very long. People recycle the bricks and the timber and the tin and all that sort of thing, and the farmers, you know, come in and take the stuff that's useful. And occasionally, a few odd walls that are hard to knock down remain standing, and then people do their sort of graffiti, you know, their religious and sexual preferences and all that sort of thing, and which is quite vulgar and sometimes, you know, quite nicely illustrated. But, so I got intrigued with this, and there was one wall in particular in a place called Nanine, which was a very thriving gold mining town at one stage, but there's not a building standing there now, and this wall had all these obscenities written on, and through the window you could see this beautiful landscape, you know, and that's the way I painted the picture. It's like with a wall with, you know, what a twit Fraser is and all that sort of thing, and I won't give you some of the other language. But, and then there's lovely, and I call it inside outside, and, because there's the vandalised wall and the beautiful landscape, which is totally ignored by people.
You've also talked about scratching the surface of a salt lake, Lake Austin.
Yeah.
And
I thought I was going to do the biggest drawing in the world. A salt lake is like a vast white, you know, sometimes 50 miles long and you know, several kilometres wide. So I thought I'd do a large drawing, because the salt is only a thin layer on the ferric oxide colour earth. So I got a stick and I started to draw this figure of a striding person. You're rather like those English things, chalkmen on the downs and that sort of. So I thought I'd do something that could be seen from the air. And I got as far as the top of his boot, which was about you know, as big as this room, and I started to go down in the mud, and my rather large Rhodesian ridgebacks were walking around out further, and they came up with big globs of mud, and they just couldn't understand what was happening to them. They were shaking it off. So I had to abandon my large-scale striding figure with one boot.
We've had an incident of that here, haven't we? Is it Meriden? What's the name of that big Aboriginal drawing that we... Murray, is it? Yeah. Well, look, if we could just have a quick word about influences. I know that every artist, sooner or later, faces up to the idea that particular people have had influences. Could you tell us something about Paul Klee, for example?
Yes, well, when I was at art school in England, we had a very eccentric art teacher, Edward Grunspan, who got put in jail at one stage for pretending to be a doctor and attending bomb sites because the Blitz was on and, you know, people were getting killed, and you know, including a few of my school friends. But he had access, God knows how, to a famous collection of, or a collection of famous artists' works, like Renoir, Soutine. I don't know whether you know Soutine's work. He was a Jewish painter, and he brought in a great skinned rabbit about that long. And somebody told me the other day they'd seen it in a collection. I've never seen it reproduced. But and then Sisley, Picasso, and one that intrigued me that you just mentioned, Paul Klee. And these paintings were left in a fairly sort of unsecure corridor in an art school where anybody could walk in any time of the day or night. and there they were. They called it Picture of the Week, and we could touch them, you know, and see them and examine them very closely. And I was intrigued with the Paul Klee and the Soutine rather. And so to get back to the influence of the thing, it's not, excuse me, just not Paul Klee. I'm fairly eclectic in my influences, and I think I've absorbed the influences of you know, people like Matisse and Klee, and not so much Picasso. His early work I like, but not terribly fond of his later stuff. And Persian miniatures, Japanese art. You know, I think I've absorbed those. But I still keep an eye out for some arresting sort of image that I might see or, you know, put in the back of my mind. One has to avoid plagiarism, of course, but you know, as Picasso said, it's necessary to copy somebody else, but pathetic to copy yourself. From a man who copied himself most of his life.
Can I throw in one or two others?
Yes,
Stanley Spencer?
Yes, Stanley Spencer. Well, one of the biggest regrets of my life, I admired Stanley Spencer so much as an art student, and he was an official war artist, and I went up to the Tate Gallery, and I saw his wonderful series that he'd done on the Clydeside welders, which some of you might be familiar with. And there's a long paintings with the various stages of shipbuilding, and the iridescent colours that he used were absolutely marvellous, and the paint was almost still wet. But one of my biggest regrets is that I've recently read a biography of him by an Englishman, and whom I wrote to. He in his biography, he mentioned that Stanley Spencer was very welcoming of art students and people. And what's more, if I'd had the scratch, I could have bought one of his paintings for about 30 quid, you know, in those days.
And one of the great eccentrics of them all.
Oh, a wonderful eccentric. Yeah, he'd be seen around Cookham with his pram. Baby's pram with all his painting paraphernalia, with an umbrella over the top, and that's where he used to sit by the side of the river and paint his pictures.
Stanley used to paint in a three-piece navy pinstripe suit.
Yeah.
And never comb his hair. Never ever combed his hair. He was clean, but he just didn't have a comb.
And he thought it was rather odd that his wife wouldn't allow him to have a mistress as a ménage à trois in the family. He couldn't understand that.
Stanley brought a woman home one day and just said to his wife, "The three of us are going to live together." And his wife said, "Oh, no, we're not."
Good news for you.
What about Matthew Smith, Robert?
Matthew Smith, yes, and he see all these artists we were exposed to as students, and Matthew Smith was one of those wonderful sort of English painters like John Piper, who very textural sort of things, and you know, dark colours, slashing sort of paint, but figurative work, but with that sort of strong feeling of abstraction in it. You know, Fauvism, not terribly. No.
Vincent van Gogh.
Passionately at one stage, but now I see him in a sort of a context as. Can I tell you a little anecdote about that? Well, when I was art master at Guildford Grammar School, the nursing sister came over the art room. She was a very toffy English lady, and she said, "Mr. Juniper," she said, "I'd like a painting for the waiting room in the infirmary." And I said, "Oh, okay, sister, what do you like?" And she said, "Well, very fond of Van Gogh." And she said, you know, expecting to get a reproduction on the wall. So I said, "Okay, right." So I had my 6 senior students there, and I showed them how to do a forgery. You see. So I got the canvas exactly the right size and scaled up, you know, and you know, scaled the drawing up so everything was in the right spot. And I painted the Van Gogh in a couple of days, and the boys were, you know, very interested. I sent one of them over to the sister's infirmary with the thing, and she came back a couple of days later and she said, "Mr. Juniper," she said, "I owe you an apology." And I said, "Why is that, sister?" And she said, "Well, I hadn't realised that you were a painter in your own right." And she said, "The Van Gogh is very beautiful." I said, "Well, I said you wanted a Van Gogh, so you know, you got it." Anyway, she was at the school for about 6 months, and she buzzed off back to England, like a lot of them do, and she took the painting with her, which she shouldn't have done actually because it was school property. But anyway, she wrote to me about a year later, and she said, "The Van Gogh hangs in pride place in my living room," and she said, "And some people came a little while ago." This reminded me. She said, and they'd been to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and they'd seen the original, and they said, "Your painting is better." It probably looked a bit fresher, let's put it that way.
What about the Australian painter Sam Fulbrook? I know you've got a lot of time for Sam.
No, Sam and I like brothers. He's a great mentor and an early influence, yeah, and I love his work. I bought one of his paintings about half a century ago, and it still hangs in my house, and I've never got tired of it. It's one of those paintings. It's 3 little Aboriginal girls standing on the jetty at La Perouse, which was in those days not as an industrial place like it is now.
He has a wonderful whimsical...
He does, yeah.
Hugh Ramsey, can I...
Well, no, they're interesting painters, but, you know...
outside your interest. I just thought that maybe with...
I admire their skill and their technique, but no, there's no... he was more... Yeah, sure. I can't paint like that, you know. And I suppose the only painters that I admire are the ones that I can't paint like.
Well, let's talk about a mutual friend of ours, Tom Gleghorn.
Yeah, Tommy, yeah.
So when I first started work, just very quickly, I worked at Farmer's Department Store in the city. Tom worked there as a display artist, and he gave me a box of paints once that had belonged to William Dobell. A box of paints and an easel. He was a very generous man. Did you find him generous?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. I met him quite by accident. A friend of and colleague of mine from our commercial art days came over to Sydney, and he got a job at Farmers, as you know, Bill Langdon. Did you ever meet him?
Yes,
as the display artist, and he was up there sketching in the Domain one day, and a lady came up and said, "Can I have a look at what you're doing?" And he said, "Yeah, sure." And she said, "My husband Tom paints," and she had a baby in a pram, and she invited him up to stay with them at Newcastle on the edge of Lake Macquarie, where Dobell lived around the corner. Wanji, yeah. And I arrived on a plane, and Bill said, "We're going up to Newcastle tomorrow." So I said, "Okay." So we went out on the Red Thunder lift to Newcastle and stayed with Tom and Elsie for several weeks. I got a job in a cement factory, and
Tom was a shipbuilder.
Tom was a shipwright, yes. But he was so shy about his work, he wouldn't show them to us. He kept all his paintings under a bed, and he would under no circumstances bring them out to show them to us, because he was then unrecognised, and it was only after I came back to Western Australia that he started to exhibit, and Hal Missingham became a friend and mentor and gave him many prizes.
Yes.
And
Still alive.
he is, and
Really? Yeah.
Wonderful teacher.
Nice man.
Yeah, he's a nice man. Yeah. They called him the oldest bodgy in New South Wales. He used to dress in a very hippie way. He still does. He had jewellery all up his arms.
But he had a beguiling smile, I remember.
He's a lovely man.
He could sort of win you over just in one quick look. Well, we're approaching the end of this interview. Are there any questions that have come up in your mind, or anything that you'd like to ask Robert about or say while you've got the opportunity? Yes.
I'd like to know when you know, as many people know, when your painting is finished.
The question is when a painting is finished.
Yeah, it's a strange one, that, because when I was at primary school in England, we had an art teacher named Millet, namesake of a famous English artist, but no relation. and he was a stern disciplinarian, and he was certainly no art teacher, because he used to almost without fail draw what he wanted you to paint on the blackboard in white chalk, which was almost invariably a stream with a mill, with a mill wheel, and a couple of poplar trees. and boy, could I ever get those off. And a little sheet of grey paper like that, a little tin of water, and a box of paints. In half an hour, you had to do this painting. So I did mine very quickly, and I said, "Please, sir," and he looked up from his novel, and he said, "What is it, Juniper?" And I said, "I've finished my painting, sir. May I have another piece of paper?" And he said, "Juniper, no painting is ever finished." Back to his novel. And I took him at his word, you know, and I thought, instead of realising he was a lazy old bugger, and he didn't want to give me another sheet of paper. So, to get back to your question, there's got to be some moment when it doesn't hurt anymore. But the curators at the art gallery won't let me near any of my old work that needs a bit of restoration, and they say no, you don't, under strict supervision. Anyway, I'd done a mural for the National Bank in Perth, and it was 50 feet long by about that deep, and it went around a sort of a frieze thing around a wall, and somewhere along I wasn't very well known in those days. It cost them about 100 quid for this thing. Somewhere along the line, somebody had the bright idea of cutting some air conditioning ducts into it. So they cut five holes in this thing. And subsequently, when the bank was demolished, somebody put the panels. They were all done on masonite, and put them in a cellar. And then, as my reputation grew, somebody twigged and said, "Oh, we got these things down in the cellar." And they went to a lady called Cherry Lewis, who is a dealer, and they said, "How much are these worth?" And she looked at them. She said, "Nothing." She said, "And you'll be very lucky if the artist doesn't sue you for defacing his work." And so they said to me, would I repair them? And I said, for them. And I said, no way. I said, I'll take them from you. And they said, okay, you can have them as long as you don't tell anybody we cut the air conditioning duct. I said, well, I'm cutting my throat split to death. Of course, I told everybody. You know, so. Anyway, I've just repaired them for the art gallery, and to get back to retouching paintings. I said, I'll do them to Alan Dodge and the curator. But they still didn't trust me. They covered them all in opaque plastic, and only left the bits that I had to report. No, translucent plastic, I mean, because I could see the original image through, and I could remember where the lines went. And it took me about 3 or 4 hours to do the 5 panels. And all the staff came down and said, marvellous. And I said, but you don't trust me, do you? They said, no. So these are the little patches. They wouldn't let me put one brushstroke on the original panel.
This idea of finishing a painting like that or wanting to repaint is not new. I think Arthur Streeton did that. Tom Roberts came back to paintings. And Pierre Bonneau also had a method that he employed. He'd go to galleries and he'd take with him 2 things. He'd take a friend and he'd take a box of paints in his inside pocket. Yeah. The friend was to distract the guard. Yeah. And the paints were to make alterations or finish off things that he wasn't happy with.
Well, Turner got chucked out of the Tate Gallery. He was a very rich man, but he always dressed like an old tramp, you know, a black coat and things. He set up his little stall in front of one of his pictures. The guards came and seized him.
Sorry, there's a question there. Yes. Adding black lines, yeah. And apropos of Robert's story of things being cut down, you're in good company because Rembrandt's Night Watch had a foot sawed off the top of it and 9 inches sawed off either side. Now, as I say, we're getting towards a conclusion. We can't be here all night, even though we might like to be. Yeah, that's right. Well, I'd just like to conclude, I suppose, by bringing Robert Juniper into the lexicon of Australian landscape painters. You know, this country has been very rich in landscape painters right from the time that Conrad Martins and the others arrived here, you know, prior to the 1830s or in the 1830s. They've painted all over the country, and people like Westing painted in Western Australia. The Heidelberg School painters came along, followed by Drysdale, followed by great names like Lloyd Rees and John Olsen. But I hope you'll agree with me in saying or thinking that Robert Juniper has already found his way into the history of landscape painting in the country. And I think it'd be nice now if we could all join together in thanking Robert for such a marvellous...
Thank you very much, Gary.